Mark Ellis was nobody, a quiet, unemployed man lost in the crowd. But behind that unremarkable face hid a ruthless mind that built one of the most powerful global drug empires the world had ever seen. This is the story of how a man with no skills and no future changed everything, and how the secrets he kept finally brought him down. Mark Ellis was the kind of man you never noticed. In his small hometown, he blended into the background, a face lost in the crowd, with no job, no skills, and no clear direction. People saw him as someone who had given up on life, a man drifting without purpose. He spent most days wandering aimlessly, avoiding conversations and keeping to himself. But beneath that quiet, almost invisible exterior, there was a mind that was far from ordinary. Life had never been kind to Mark. Growing up, he struggled in school, never finding a subject that clicked or a talent that stood out. After high school, he bounced between odd jobs that never lasted long. His reputation as unreliable only grew. Friends disappeared, opportunities vanished, and soon he was left alone with nothing but a small apartment in a rundown part of town and a growing pile of unpaid bills. But Mark had learned something crucial early on. People don't see what they don't want to see. Being overlooked gave him an unexpected advantage. Without anyone paying attention, he had the freedom to observe, to plan, and to dream without interference. While others chased quick success, he studied the streets, the people, and the hidden opportunities around him. He wasn't just invisible, he was gathering pieces for something bigger. What no one understood was how sharp and ruthless Mark's mind was beneath the surface. He wasn't someone who could be easily pushed aside. He absorbed every detail, every weakness in the system, and every crack in the lives of those around him. Slowly, he started thinking about how to change his fate, not with brute force or flashy moves, but through careful strategy and patience. Mark's story didn't begin with a grand plan or a criminal background. It began with a man who had nada, who no one believed in, and who quietly decided to rewrite his future. This is the story of how an invisible man dismissed by everyone built a secret empire that would shake the world. With no money and no clear path, Mark knew his first step into the world of crime had to be small and careful. He couldn't afford mistakes, but he also couldn't wait for a perfect opportunity. It didn't exist. So he started selling small amounts of drugs on the streets, operating in the shadows where nobody would connect him to anything bigger. At first the deals were clumsy and risky. Mark was new to this life, and every interaction was a test of his nerve and ability to stay unnoticed. The early days were full of failures, some deals fell through, and on a few occasions, Mark barely escaped dangerous confrontations. But these setbacks didn't discourage him. Instead, they taught him valuable lessons about trust and betrayal, two things that would become central to his survival. He quickly learned that loyalty was rare and that betrayal could come from the most unexpected places. People in this world played a dangerous game, and Mark realized he needed to be smarter than everyone else. He also discovered the importance of keeping a low profile. Unlike many dealers who flaunted their success, Mark stayed in the background. He never attracted attention with flashy cars or loud behavior. This invisibility made it easier for him to operate quietly and avoid early encounters with law enforcement. More importantly, it gave him time to think bigger. Mark understood that selling drugs on the streets was just the beginning. The real money, the real power came from building connections, finding reliable suppliers and trustworthy buyers. He began reaching out carefully, testing the waters with small contacts beyond his immediate circle. These early alliances were fragile and often tested by suspicion, but Mark's cautious approach helped him slowly expand his reach. By the end of this phase, Mark had moved from a desperate man making small deals to someone who could command respect in a dangerous world. He was no longer just surviving. He was planning, learning, and preparing for something much larger. This was the moment when a man with no skills or job started transforming into a force to be reckoned with. Mark quickly realized that running a small local drug operation wasn't enough to reach the level of power and money he dreamed of. If he wanted to build something bigger, he needed to create a hidden web of connections that could stretch beyond his town, beyond the borders even. But how do you grow an empire without anyone knowing who's really behind it? The answer was secrecy. Mark became obsessed with staying invisible while expanding his reach. He learned to use technology in ways most street dealers never even considered. Instead of meeting buyers and suppliers face to face, he started using encrypted messaging apps, carefully crafted code names, and burner phones that vanished after a single use. This made it nearly impossible for law enforcement to trace him. His communication was deliberate and controlled. Each message was short, vague, and sent only when necessary. He built a system where everyone in the chain knew only what they needed to know. No more, no less. This compartmentalization kept the network safe from internal betrayal and external investigation. Even the closest allies rarely met in person, reducing the chance of exposure. Mark also diversified his contacts. He didn't just work with one group or rely on a single supplier. Instead, he found multiple sources, creating backup plans if one connection failed or was compromised. He reached out to distributors in different cities, quietly planting the seeds for future expansion. The web he spun was not only about drugs. He began establishing front businesses, small shops, delivery companies, even fake import-export firms that masked the real nature of his operations. These fronts helped move money, launder profits, and gave him a legitimate cover story if anyone started asking questions. By building this hidden network, Mark turned his small-time hustle into a complex system that stretched far beyond what anyone in his town could imagine. The Invisible Man was no longer just a local dealer. He was becoming the architect of something much larger. His empire was growing in silence, hidden beneath layers of secrecy and technology that kept him one step ahead of the law and everyone else. While many drug dealers drew attention by showing off wealth and power, Mark chose a different path. He stayed silent and calculated. His growth wasn't marked by loud displays or reckless moves, but by careful, measured steps. This quiet approach allowed him to expand into new territories without raising suspicion, making it harder for law enforcement or rival gangs to track his movements. Mark's strategy was simple but effective. Instead of rushing into new areas, he studied them like a chess player analyzed the board. He watched local markets, learned about rival groups, and identified gaps where his operation could fit without triggering conflict. When the time was right, he sent trusted contacts to build connections, often recruiting people who seemed unlikely partners, outsiders, former criminals looking for a fresh start, or even tech-savvy individuals who could help with communication and logistics. These recruits were carefully vetted, and loyalty was tested through small tasks before they were fully trusted. Mark didn't rely on fear or violence to keep people in line. Instead, he offered incentives, money, protection, and a share in the growing profits. This method helped him form a strong, loyal team that could operate independently while still answering to him. Mark also learned to work with corrupt officials and law enforcement officers. These dangerous alliances were risky, but they provided valuable protection and insider information. By quietly bribing key people and using blackmail when necessary, he created a shield around his expanding network. This gave him the freedom to move shipments and make deals that would have been impossible otherwise. The empire grew steadily, spreading across cities and even countries. Each new territory added to his influence and profits, but Mark never lost control. His careful planning ensured that the empire was like a well-oiled machine, with different parts working together seamlessly without exposing the whole. Behind the calm exterior of an unemployed man was a ruthless mind managing a global operation. Mark's silent expansion was not just growth. It was a takeover, piece by piece, territory by territory, and the world outside had no idea who was behind it all. Mark knew that staying hidden was just as important as growing his empire. To avoid detection, he became a master of disguise, not just physically, but in every aspect of his life. He created fake identities with carefully forged documents and built a network of fronts that masked his true activities. These fronts looked like ordinary businesses, cafes, import-export companies, and small delivery services that seemed harmless but were actually essential cogs in his empire. With multiple fake identities, Mark could move freely, without raising suspicion. He had driver's licenses, bank accounts, and rental agreements all under different names. This complicated any attempt by law enforcement to trace his real identity. Even people close to his operation often didn't know what he looked like or where he lived. He rarely appeared in public, instead communicating through intermediaries or encrypted messages. Mark's lifestyle was deliberately unremarkable. Unlike the stereotypical drug lord flaunting luxury cars and mansions, he dressed simply and avoided expensive habits. This modesty helped him avoid attention from neighbors, officials, or rival criminals who might want to challenge him. To the outside world, he was just another ordinary man struggling to get by. But behind this plain appearance was a man who controlled vast amounts of money and power. The legitimate businesses he owned served as cover for laundering profits and moving goods. These companies gave his empire a veneer of respectability, making it harder for authorities to connect the dots. When shipments crossed borders, they traveled under the names of these businesses, hidden inside legitimate cargo. Mark's ability to live a double life was one of his greatest strengths. It allowed him to keep his personal world separate from his criminal empire, reducing the risk of exposure. This separation also gave him peace of mind to focus on the bigger picture, building a network that could survive even if parts of it were uncovered. By perfecting the art of disguise and deception, Mark transformed from an unemployed man into a figure no one suspected. His true identity remained a secret, locked away behind layers of falsehoods and careful planning, making him untouchable, at least for a time. To grow his empire beyond local limits, Mark knew he had to form alliances with powerful and dangerous groups. This meant dealing with ruthless cartel leaders and violent gangs who controlled vast territories and resources. These partnerships were essential but extremely risky. One wrong move could mean betrayal or death. Mark approached these alliances with caution, using negotiation and calculated moves instead of brute force. He never rushed into agreements. Instead, he studied each potential partner's strengths, weaknesses, and reputation. Trust was rare, so Mark made sure every deal had clear benefits for both sides. He offered a share of profits, promised reliable shipments, and demonstrated his careful planning and professionalism. Over time, some of these dangerous groups came to respect Mark not as a rival but as an able collaborator. These alliances gave Mark access to new markets and supply routes that would have been impossible to control alone. Cartels provided large quantities of drugs and muscle, while gangs helped with local distribution and enforcement. This network created a powerful chain that stretched across countries, increasing profits and influence. But working with such violent partners meant constant danger. Rivalries between groups could flare up at any moment, and some partners tried to take advantage of Mark's cautious nature. He faced several attempts at betrayal, including ambushes and sabotage. Each time, Mark used his sharp mind to outmaneuver his enemies, turning threats into opportunities. Mark also learned to play factions against each other, preventing any one group from gaining too much power or becoming a direct threat. He maintained communication with all sides, carefully balancing relationships and using information as a weapon. This delicate diplomacy was key to keeping his empire stable. Despite the danger, these partnerships were crucial. They helped him avoid attention from neighbors, officials, or rival criminals who might want to challenge him. To the outside world, he was just another ordinary man struggling to get by. But behind this plain appearance was a man who controlled vast amounts of money and power. The legitimate businesses he owned served as cover for laundering profits and moving goods. These companies gave his empire a veneer of respectability, making it harder for authorities to connect the dots. When shipments crossed borders, they traveled under the names of these businesses, hidden inside legitimate cargo. Mark's ability to live a double life was one of his greatest strengths. It allowed him to keep his personal world separate from his criminal empire, reducing the risk of exposure. This separation also gave him peace of mind to focus on the bigger picture, building a network that could survive even if parts of it were uncovered. By perfecting the art of disguise and deception, Mark transformed from an unemployed man into a figure no one suspected. His true identity remained a secret, locked away behind layers of falsehoods and careful planning, making him untouchable, at least for a time. To grow his empire beyond local limits, Mark knew he had to form alliances with powerful and dangerous groups. This meant dealing with ruthless cartel leaders and violent gangs who controlled vast territories and resources. These partnerships were essential but extremely risky. One wrong move could mean betrayal or death. Mark approached these alliances with caution, using negotiation and calculated moves instead of brute force. He never rushed into agreements. Instead, he studied each potential partner's strengths, weaknesses, and reputation. Trust was rare, so Mark made sure every deal had clear benefits for both sides. He offered a share of profits, promised reliable shipments, and demonstrated his careful planning and professionalism. Over time, some of these dangerous groups came to respect Mark not as a rival but as an able collaborator. These alliances gave Mark access to new markets and supply routes that would have been impossible to control alone. Cartels provided large quantities of drugs and muscle, while gangs helped with local distribution and enforcement. This network created a powerful chain that stretched across countries, increasing profits and influence. But working with such violent partners meant constant danger. Rivalries between groups could flare up at any moment, and some partners tried to take advantage of Mark's cautious nature. He faced several attempts at betrayal, including ambushes and sabotage. Each time, Mark used his sharp mind to outmaneuver his enemies, turning threats into opportunities. Mark also learned to play factions against each other, preventing any one group from gaining too much power or becoming a direct threat. He maintained communication with all sides, carefully balancing relationships and using information as a weapon. This delicate diplomacy was key to keeping his empire stable. Despite the danger, these partnerships were crucial to Mark's rise. They turned a small operation into a global network, showing that his quiet, patient approach was more effective than violence or intimidation alone. The alliances he formed created both strength and risk, setting the stage for the empire's eventual attitudes and the shocking revelations to come. In a world where borders and law enforcement constantly challenged drug traffickers, Mark realized early on that technology could become his greatest weapon. Unlike many others in the trade who relied solely on muscle and street smarts, he embraced innovation to stay ahead. Technology didn't just help him hide, it helped him grow and protect his empire in ways no one expected. Mark invested in encryption tools that kept his communications secure. Messages between suppliers, distributors, and couriers were encoded in complex ways that made them nearly impossible for authorities to intercept or understand. He trained his network to use secure apps and devices, creating a digital fortress around his operations. But Mark didn't stop at encrypted messages. He explored new methods for transporting drugs safely and discreetly. Drones began to replace traditional couriers on risky routes, flying over checkpoints and dangerous territories where human messengers might be caught or ambushed. These unmanned flights carried small but valuable shipments, reducing losses and increasing speed. Online marketplaces on the dark web became another tool in his arsenal. Mark's operation used these hidden corners of the internet to buy and sell without revealing identities or locations. This virtual marketplace allowed him to connect with buyers and sellers worldwide, expanding his empire far beyond physical borders. Money laundering was another challenge Mark tackled with technology. He used cryptocurrencies and complex financial transactions through multiple accounts and countries to disguise the origins of his profits. By layering transactions and using anonymous wallets, he made it almost impossible for investigators to trace the flow of money. Mark also used data analytics to track supply and demand patterns. By analyzing information about drug trends, law enforcement activities, and rival movements, he could adjust his strategies quickly and efficiently. This allowed him to anticipate problems before they happened and seize new opportunities faster than his competitors. Technology gave Mark an edge that many drug lords lacked. It made his empire more efficient, safer, and harder to break. His willingness to innovate and adapt turned what began as a small street operation into a sophisticated global network, one built on secrecy, speed, and smarts. No empire built on secrets lasts forever. Despite all his careful planning, Mark's drug empire began to show signs of vulnerability. It started with a sudden raid on one of his front businesses in a mid-sized city. Law enforcement officers, acting on a tip, stormed the location and uncovered a shipment of drugs hidden within legitimate goods. The operation shook the network, sending shockwaves through the empire. This raid was only the beginning. Investigators intensified their efforts, piecing together clues from surveillance footage, intercepted communications, and informants. Mark's layered secrecy made it difficult, but not impossible, to penetrate. Slowly, cracks appeared. Trusted associates were arrested or disappeared, and shipments were delayed or lost. The carefully woven web began to unravel. What made this period even more shocking was the discovery that no one expected: Mark's true identity. For years he had hidden behind fake names and forged documents, but investigators uncovered a past that turned the story upside down. Mark Ellis was not just an unknown unemployed man, he was someone with a completely different history. The man at the center of this global drug empire was living under a stolen identity. This revelation stunned law enforcement and the public alike. It raised countless questions. Who was the real Mark Ellis? Why had he chosen to disappear and build a criminal empire under a false name? The answers hinted at a past filled with scandal, secrets, and a desperate need to escape. The unmasking also changed the way authorities approached the case. With his real background exposed, they could dig deeper into his motives and connections, uncovering links to a high-profile corporate scandal he had vanished from years before. Suddenly, Mark was no longer just a drug lord. He was a man running from his past while building a new, dangerous identity. The empire's fall was not immediate, but the cracks grew wider. Mark's perfect disguise had been shattered, and the pressure was mounting. What had begun as a hidden empire built on silence and secrecy was now exposed to the harsh light of investigation and betrayal. The story was far from over, but the game had changed forever. The revelation of Mark's true identity shocked everyone involved in the investigation. For years, the man they thought was a low-level, invisible dealer turned out to be someone far more complex and dangerous. The real Mark Ellis was a former corporate executive named Michael Reed, who had disappeared from the public eye after a major scandal shook the business world. His fall from grace had been swift and brutal, leaving him with a ruined reputation and no legal way to rebuild his life. Michael Reed's story was one of betrayal and desperation. After being accused of financial fraud, he vanished, cutting ties with his past and assuming a new identity to escape the consequences. Under the name Mark Ellis, he started from scratch, but unlike others who fade away, he used this second chance to build something unimaginable, a drug empire spanning continents. This twist explained much about Mark's extraordinary strategic mind and his ability to manage complex operations. His corporate background gave him skills most criminals lacked: financial acumen, understanding of global markets, and the ability to organize people like a CEO running a business. It wasn't just luck or street smarts. It was cold, calculated expertise applied to an illegal industry. The investigators pieced together how Michael had erased his old life, creating layers of deception to protect himself. Fake documents, stolen identities, and front companies all hid the truth for years. But once uncovered, this history opened new avenues for law enforcement, connecting Mark's criminal empire to networks previously thought unrelated. This revelation also added a human dimension to the story. It showed how desperation and fear of failure could push someone to extremes, transforming a fallen businessman into one of the world's most elusive drug lords. The man everyone underestimated wasn't just lucky, he was brilliant, ruthless, and willing to sacrifice everything to survive. With his true identity exposed, Mark's empire began to crumble under the weight of investigations and betrayal. The man who had built a global empire from nothing was now fighting to hold on to the last pieces of his carefully constructed life. The truth was out, but the final chapter was yet to be written. With Mark's true identity finally exposed, the walls around his empire began to close in. Law enforcement agencies from multiple countries coordinated their efforts, sharing intelligence and resources to bring him down. What had once been a hidden network of trusted allies and secret routes started to crumble under the relentless pressure of arrests, betrayals, and failed shipments. Mark's allies, once loyal and cautious, began to question his ability to protect them. Fear and uncertainty spread through the organization as leaders scrambled to save themselves. Some turned informant, trading information for lighter sentences. Others vanished without a trace, leaving gaps in the empire that were impossible to fill. Mark's careful balance of power shattered as his network fractured from within. Despite the chaos, Mark remained calm. He used every trick he had learned over the years: fake meetings, encrypted communications, and multiple layers of deception to stay ahead. But the truth was clear. The empire was no longer his to control. His carefully built fortress was crumbling, and the law was closing in fast. The final moment came in a quiet suburb, far from the city's glare. After months of surveillance, officers moved in swiftly and decisively. Mark was arrested without violence, caught off guard by the speed and precision of the operation. The man who had once been invisible was suddenly front and center in a global scandal. His arrest sent shockwaves through the criminal world and beyond. Media outlets around the world picked up the story of an unemployed man who rose from nothing to become a ruthless drug lord, only to be brought down by the very secrets he tried to bury. The empire he built was dismantled piece by piece, but the legend of Mark Ellis, Michael Reed, would live on. As Mark faced trial, questions remained. How did a man with no skills or job manage to build such a vast empire? What drove him to risk everything? And perhaps most hauntingly, what happens when the invisible man finally loses his disguise? The story ended, but its echoes would be felt for years to come.